pre-planned strike against 3 designated sites that had no military value. So we put a B-2 bomber over a target to drop 2 very large bombs that accomplished nothing. It was purely a political act.
Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the place you come to unpack these really complex global events. We try to pull out the key insights, help you cut through all the noise, and really understand what's actually going on. And today, we are diving into something incredibly urgent, really critical. It's the recent U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran. We've got quite a stack of sources for this deep dive. Everything from breaking news, AP, Al Jazeera, right through to some pretty deep expert analysis from places like the German Marshall Fund, R&D. And crucially, we've got commentary from the, often controversial military analyst Scott Ritter. Our mission today to really break down Ritter's central argument, and it is controversial that this strike wasn't...
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Just how fast everything's moving and how you get these totally different perspectives framing the whole narrative around this really impactful moment. As we get into the sources, we'll be looking closely at the military specifics, grappling with the big legal arguments, and tracing those ripple effects, which you can already see spreading across the Middle East and honestly way beyond. I think a key question we'll keep coming back to in this deep dive is, was this strike really a calculated move? Was it designed to, quote, decapitate Iran's nuclear program, like some officials are saying? Or was it something far more precarious, like Ritter suggests, an action that pushes the U.S. into acting like a rogue nation, operating outside international law? And that could have potentially catastrophic, unforeseen consequences for global stability down the line.
Okay, right. Let's unpack the strike itself first, the immediate facts. So, Sunday, June 22nd, 2025, pre-dawn hours. The U.S. military launches Operation Midnight Hammer. That's the official name. And this wasn't minor. It was a significant operation hitting 3 specific critical sites in Iran designated nuclear and military facilities. The Pentagon, they didn't waste any time spinning their version. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Air Force General Dan Kane, he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they briefed the media that Sunday morning. Their description emphasized decoys, deception, and this really striking claim that the operation met with no Iranian resistance.
No resistance. That's a key phrase we need to circle back to, definitely.
Absolutely. And this wasn't just like a small intervention. Yeah. The U.S. explicitly said it was joining Israel's longstanding effort to, their words, decapitate the country's nuclear program. The level of commitment was pretty clear. President Trump himself spoke from the White House East Room on Saturday, June 21st. He had VP J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Hegseth right there with him. So high-level buy-in, no question.
Signaling the gravity of the decision. Yeah.
Exactly. And the strike itself. We're talking advanced missiles and, get this, 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs. For anyone who knows military hardware, that screams a serious attempt to hit hardened underground targets. Deep penetration.
Massive ordnance. Designed for exactly that kind of target.
We even have visual satellite images from Planet Labs PBC. They showed visible craters at Fordo, Iran's underground enrichment site, right after the strikes. So, tangible proof of the power unleashed.
Undeniable physical evidence of something happening, at least on the surface.
Right. And just to give you a sense of the scale, B-2 bomber, the stealth bomber famous for deep strikes, it was reported arriving back at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri on Sunday, June 22nd, after an incredible 37-hour journey, all the way there to strike Fordo and back, apparently equipped with a toilet, microwave, snack cooler, the works for a long-haul mission.
A 37-hour flight just underlines the planning, the resources, the sheer determination behind this single strike mission.
It was, by all accounts, a very deliberate, very costly, and meticulously planned military operation.
So zooming out a bit, what this operation really does is highlight Washington putting itself directly into a conflict it had, for decades, very deliberately tried to stay out of. For Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, this was huge, almost like validation for a long game. He was quick to praise Trump's decision, called it one that will change history, and that fits perfectly with his decades-long push to get the U.S. to hit Iran's nuclear program.
A goal he's pursued relentlessly.
Yeah. But as you'd expect, the rest of the world and Iran itself reacted fast and pretty forcefully. Iran's immediate reaction, lashing out, saying the U.S. crossed a very big red line, calling the whole thing a risky gambit.
Strong words.
Very strong. And Iran's UN ambassador, Amir Saeed Iravani, he spoke at an emergency UN Security Council meeting, said the U.S. decided to destroy diplomacy, flat out. And then he declared that the Iranian military would figure out the timing, nature, and scale of what he termed a proportionate response.
proportionate response.
Wow.
Always a loaded term in these situations.
Absolutely. And signaling their strategic alignment, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araki, he immediately flew to Moscow to coordinate with Russia, their close ally. A clear move to shore up their position, diplomatically and militarily.
Consolidating support makes sense.
And beyond the main players, you felt the ripples globally. The U.S. State Department quickly warned U.S. citizens worldwide, told them to exercise increased caution. They boosted emergency evacuation plans in the Middle East, ramped up travel warnings, non-essential staff ordered out of the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon.
Wow, okay, so tangible impacts immediately.
Immediately. Emergency evacuation flights for Americans out of Israel to Europe, they doubled them. 67 citizens left on Saturday. But then Israeli airspace closed after the U.S. strike, so 3 out of 4 flights planned for Sunday got canceled. It just shows you the immediate disruption, the rising global alarm.
Right. Okay, so here's where this deep dive gets really compelling, I think. Because you have military analyst Scott Ritter offering this completely different interpretation of Operation Midnight Hammer. Starkly different from the official line we just talked about. He argues it wasn't just militarily useless, but actually more profoundly, it was political theater. And worse, it served only to demonstrate American impotence.
Impotence, that's a strong word.
It is. Ritter, he's known for not pulling punches. He says the U.S. is currently acting like a rogue nation, operating, quote, outside the framework of international law. He frames this U.S. strike as not a decisive action, flatly claims it did not destroy Fordo, and calls it, in his words, a national embarrassment.
Ouch. So his core argument is military uselessness.
Exactly. For Ritter, the whole thing was militarily useless because, and this is key, he claims they targeted pre-evacuated nuclear sites. If he's right about that, it means the operation achieved 0 strategic goals against Iran's actual capabilities, which would make the whole massive display of force, well, just a performance, basically, political theater.
A very expensive and risky performance, if that's the case.
Precisely. Now let's look at the evidence Ritter points to for this military ineffectiveness, this American impotence. Remember the Pentagon claim? No Iranian resistance? Ritter flips that. He sees the lack of resistance not as success, but as proof of the strike's ineffectiveness against defenses that were already prepared.
So if the sites were evacuated or hardened, like he suggests,
Then why would there be resistance? The absence of a fight could just mean there was nothing or no one critical left there to defend. That's his logic.
makes a certain kind of sense, if his premise about evacuation is correct.
And this view gets some backing from actual Associated Press reports on the ground. They support this idea of limited immediate impact. The AP reported that, quote, daily life in Tehran appeared largely unaffected Sunday after U.S. strikes on nuclear and military sites. They said no disruption to electricity, water, or basic services reported. And even some residents having now returned to the city after fleeing last week.
That does paint a different picture than you'd expect after a supposedly decapitating strike, doesn't it? Business as usual, almost.
It really does. And then you have the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, Rafael Mariano Grossi. He told the Security Council that, quote, no one was in a position to assess the underground damage at Fordo, which is dug deep into a mountain. He acknowledged the visible craters matched the U.S. announcements, sure, but crucially, he called for IAEA inspectors to be allowed onto the sites.
Which implicitly questions how much damage was really done, especially underground where it counts.
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful question about the strike's actual effectiveness. Ritter jumps right on this lack of measurable, verifiable impact on Iran's nuclear capabilities. He sees it as proof positive the strike failed, directly contradicting that stated U.S. goal of decapitation.
It really forces you to question the official narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the actual strategic value of launching such a high-profile operation.
It does. Which leads us to that critical question you raised earlier.
Right. If the military goal was genuinely to wipe out Iran's nuclear capability, why do we see such a muted impact in Tehran? And these strong claims of ineffectiveness from someone like Ritter, it points to a pretty big gap between the stated goals and the actual results. Or maybe, like Ritter says, there's a whole different purpose going on.
Like political signaling, demonstrating resolve.
Exactly. Rather than achieving a concrete military objective.
Right.
If Ritter's right, if those sites were pre-evacuated, then the enormous cost, the deployment of B-2s, those massive bunker busters, they stop being tools for a military goal and start looking more like props, right? Props in a big show of force, a performance for the world.
A performance that, in Ritter's view, backfired.
Yeah, because it inadvertently showed the limits of American power against an enemy that was prepared, that adapted, which demonstrates American impotence, as he puts it, not strength. So despite all the fireworks, the actual strategic gain was minimal, maybe zero, making the whole thing symbolic, but ultimately failing its main stated objective.
Okay, let's shift to the legal dimension, because Scott Ritter pulls absolutely no punches here. He flat out labels the U.S.-Israeli strike an unconstitutional war crime. And then conversely, he argues that Iran's retaliatory actions are in fact entirely lawful, which is, a really stark contrast to how these things are usually framed officially.
It's a provocative framing, definitely.
Yeah.
Challenging the standard narrative head on.
He claims Israel kicked things off with an unlawful, illegal surprise attack with no justification. He gets specific, saying Israel hasn't even tried to make cognizable an argument under Article 51 preeminent self-defense.
Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defense. That's the usual justification trotted out.
Right. And Ritter says they can't lose it. Why? Because, quote, any imminent threat was nullified by the fact that the Iranians were actively in negotiations dealing with the very issue at hand.
So his argument is, if you're negotiating about the supposed threat, it can't logically be imminent enough to justify a preemptive strike under Article 51.
That seems to be his core legal point regarding the initial strike. But we should acknowledge other viewpoints, that RAND Q&A offers a different take on Israel's thinking. They suggest Israel felt it was genuinely almost out of time to stop an Iranian bomb, that they saw this as a unique, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity after October 7th.
Why then specifically?
Because, according to RAND, Israel felt they'd already weakened Iran's proxies, especially Hezbollah, and had taken out some key Iranian air defenses. So it was a moment of perceived vulnerability for Iran.
Framing it as preemptive necessity, driven by urgency and a perceived window of opportunity. A very different legal and strategic calculus than Ritter's.
Exactly. Two completely different narratives about the justification.
Okay, so turning to the other side of the ledger, Ritter's view on Iran's actions. He insists Iran has gone to the United Nations and has said that they will defend themselves. He argues that Iran's legitimacy of carrying out these strikes against Israel continue until which time Israel stops striking Iran. So it's a continuous right of response, in his view.
He even says it is literally the more Israel bombs Iran, the more legitimate Iran's retaliation becomes. That's quite a statement.
It completely reframes Iran as acting defensively within international law, responding to an initial illegal act, not as the aggressor.
And Iran's UN ambassador, Iravani, he backed this up forcefully, didn't he? Saying the U.S. decided to destroy diplomacy and that Iran's military would deliver that proportionate response?
Yes, and Iravani added more weight to Iran's claims by making those specific accusations against Israel alleging deliberate war crimes, acts of state terror, and examples of barbaric warfare for targeting medical facilities.
Right, he cited those alleged attacks on June 16th, the Children's Hospital in Tehran, the Rehab Hospital in Kermanshah, the Red Crescent Building, ambulances.
Claims that reported killing and injuring doctors, patients, medical staff, horrific allegations that really underscore the human cost.
And it highlights the complexity because you mentioned Israeli hospital workers also called the strike on Soroka Medical Center a war crime.
Exactly. It shows how loaded and contested the term lawful becomes in the middle of a conflict like this. Both sides are accusing the other of war crimes related to medical facilities. It's deeply troubling.
The international community is obviously watching all this with extreme concern. Lots of calls for de-escalation. UN Secretary General Guterres, he warned the Security Council things were racing towards a crisis. He pleaded for everyone to give peace a chance, saying really clearly, no military solution.
A pretty stark warning from the top UN official.
Yeah. Egypt's President Sisi also warned about grave repercussions, pushed for negotiations. Lebanon's President Aoun said the U.S. bombing could spark a regional war Lebanon is unwilling to pay more for. Understandable, given their history.
Even Pakistan chimed in, right?
Yeah.
Despite having nominated Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize recently.
That's right. They called the U.S. strikes deeply disturbing. Shows how broad the international discomfort is. Pope Leo XIV also made a plea for peace, urging diplomacy to silence the weapons. Called the situation alarming.
And it's crucial to remember, diplomacy was happening before this, wasn't it?
It was. European powers, Germany, France, UK, they were actively talking with Iran's leadership just last November, last January, discussing the nuclear issues, sanctions relief, regional security.
So a diplomatic path was open. It was being actively pursued right before the U.S. strike.
Absolutely. And France's President Macron specifically called again for Israel to stop hitting Energy, civilian infrastructure, civilian populations in Iran said flatly, there's no justification for that.
Zooming out again, these clashing legal interpretations really point to something bigger, don't they? It feels like a fundamental fight over international norms, over the use of force itself. The rules-based international order, the term the U.S. and its allies often use, is being directly challenged.
Challenged by what Ritter calls the law-based international order, the one based strictly on the UN Charter.
Exactly. And that's the framework Russia and China are pushing. Ritter points to that big 5,000-word joint statement they put out back in February 2022. They explicitly rejected the U.S.-led rules-based system and advocated for one grounded solely in the UN Charter and international law.
So this current situation, with the U.S. strike being called illegal by analysts like Ritter, that plays right into their hands.
He gives them ammunition, certainly. It allows Russia and China to paint the U.S. as ignoring international law, which helps their effort to isolate the U.S. diplomatically. This isn't just about Iran or the Middle East anymore. It's about the future of global governance. Will it be a flexible, U.S.-led order or a stricter, law-bound one championed by others? That's the underlying struggle here.
Okay, let's pivot to the geopolitical chessboard, because this isn't just strikes and counterstrikes. It's a huge global game. Scott Ritter, and other analyses too, suggest this U.S. intervention might actually backfire geopolitically, that it could isolate the U.S., strengthen the Russia-China axis, and, ironically, maybe even allow Iran to continue its lawful retaliation, as Ritter calls it, without the U.S. gaining anything tangible.
A paradoxical outcome, if true.
Ritter's pretty direct. He says countries like Russia, China, India, and Pakistan will be actively working to isolate the United States at the Security Council to prevent things escalating further.
And we already saw hints of that isolation, didn't we? With U.S. allies calling for negotiations right after the strikes.
Yeah, the AP reported several allies urged a return to talks, which suggests they weren't fully on board with the U.S. approach. And the German Marshall Fund analysis, it paints a pretty bleak picture, talking about an utter loss of European soft power globally. They say the charges of Western double standards, particularly after the Gaza war response, are getting harder to refute, which weakens Western influence.
And they warned that U.S. support for certain Israeli actions, or bombing Iran, could seriously strain U.S.-EU relations.
Right, and we're seeing practical effects. Switzerland closing its Tehran embassy temporarily because of the intensity of military operations. That's significant because Switzerland often acts as the go-between for U.S.-Iran communication.
A crucial back channel potentially disrupted, and the U.K. is pulling staff too.
Yeah, the U.K. is also withdrawing staff from their Tehran embassy, both citing the deteriorating security. It shows how unstable things are perceived to be.
Now, thinking about those global power dynamics, Ritter keeps coming back to that Russia-China joint document from February 2022, that rejection of the rules-based order in favor of a law-based order built on the UN Charter. He sees that as their main tool for isolating the U.S. now.
And Iran experts seem to agree somewhat. They noted both China and Russia are trying to position themselves as mediators.
Yeah, Rand observed that both China and Russia have sought to portray themselves as potential power brokers who can play a constructive role. They see navigating Middle East tensions as part of the broader U.S. strategic competition with China and Russia. It's all connected.
And China's role is interesting, not just economic anymore.
Right. Rand says China's traditional economic role continues ignoring U.S. sanctions, funding big infrastructure projects. But brokering that Iran-Saudi deal showed they're doing more than just economics now. China might try to leverage the perceived loss of U.S. and EU soft power to promote its own unbiased mediation efforts, maybe with Iran.
Which makes it harder to impose tough global sanctions on Iran if China isn't playing ball.
Exactly. And don't forget, the Iranian foreign minister flew straight to Moscow after the U.S. strike, underscoring that alliance and their unified front against the current international order.
Okay, beyond the big powers, what about the region itself? The Middle East. How are things shifting there? Sources like Reddit discussions show it's complicated, varied reactions in the Arab world. Some might actually see Iran weakened as a net positive, despite diplomatic ties.
Why is that?
Blaming Iran for instability in places like Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iraq. We're seeing actual shifts, too. Lebanon forming a new government opposed to Hezbollah, banning flights from Iran.
And Syria. That sounded dramatic.
Yeah, reports say Syria's new leader oversaw the burning of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, thanked Israel for helping oust Assad, demanded reparations, banned Iranians from traveling there.
Wow, that's a major turnaround.
Huge. Turkey has apparently endorsed these moves, even while calling Iran a friend. And the Saudi elite, still see Iran as the #1 destabilizing force.
But there's pushback on that narrative too, right? The regimes versus people argument.
Exactly. Other commentators argue the Arab regimes don't represent the people, that these regimes are maybe too close to the Trump administration, while the Arab street is outraged but feels powerless. Some suggest the Arab states are too weak or corrupt to challenge Israel, and if Iran falls, Israel achieves total regional dominance, a really worrying prospect for many.
And strategically, the fall of Assad in Syria late last year, helped by Turkey, that already changed things significantly.
Big time. It cut off Iran's land route to Lebanon and Syria, weakened Russia's foothold too. A major win for Turkey.
So even with these setbacks, Rand still sees Iran as a source of instability.
Yes. Rand figures Iran, despite losing deterrence, will likely remain a key source of instability. They might even try harder to rebuild their proxy networks now that those networks look weaker.
It really leads back to that core question. With the U.S. risking diplomatic isolation, maybe strengthening Russia and China, what's the actual long-term strategic win here? Especially if Ritter's right and the military goals weren't met, it feels like the whole Middle East chessboard could be reset, but nobody knows how pieces will land. And history teaches us regime change is incredibly messy, a particularly fraught business, as Rand put it.
Yeah, Rand highlighted that dilemma. Success could mean ending Iran's nuclear threat. Failure could mean another long, unpredictable U.S. conflict.
The risk of blowback seems huge if Ritter's analysis holds water: more instability, stronger anti-U.S. alliances. It's not just about the bombs anymore, is it? It's about the precedents being set.
Okay, Scott Ritter makes these incredibly bold claims, right? About Iran's response being effective, Israel's defenses being limited. So let's test that. How do his claims stack up against what's actually happening on the ground? Using the latest reports. Take June 19th, just before the big U.S. strike. Iran launches a Sejil missile at Soroka Medical Center in Beersheba, Israel.
A hospital. That's controversial, to say the least.
Highly. The Jerusalem Post called it a near-miss massacre. Caused injuries to patients, severe damage, a chemical leak, forced an evacuation. The ER was overwhelmed, and, as we noted, Israeli hospital workers called that strike a war crime.
Highlighting that grim symmetry of accusations around medical facilities.
Exactly. And it wasn't isolated. Missiles hit Haifa on Friday, June 20th. Smoke plumes, 31 people wounded at Rambam Hospital, some seriously.
So Iran is hitting targets inside Israel, causing casualties and damage. That seems clear.
Definitely. Iran also claimed a major military hit bombing Amman base. That's a key Israeli intelligence hub, oversees Unit 8200.
Unit 8200, the big signals intelligence and cyber warfare unit. A very significant target if true.
Right, and Israeli media reportedly faced military censorship about the location hit, which often suggests a successful strike on a sensitive target.
Interesting. What about the missiles themselves?
An Israeli official reported Iran used a missile with multiple warheads. Iran does have the Khorramshahr 4 missile unveiled in 2022, supposedly has a heady payload, decent range, 900 miles or so.
Advanced capabilities. And Iran claimed they shot down another Israeli F-35.
They did. Claimed a 4th F-35 kill. A big claim, given the F-35's reputation. Hard to verify independently, of course.
Naturally. And Israel's response during this period.
Israel carried out more bombings in western Iran, claimed they hit military targets, missile launchers, soldiers. They also claimed on June 21st to have killed 3 IRGC commanders, including the supposed founder of the Iranian regime's plan to destroy Israel.
So, a definite back-and-forth, tit-for-tat escalation cycle happening.
Clearly.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to Ritter's assessment in light of these events.
Yeah, how does this real-time conflict square with his analysis? The contrast between the official U.S.-Israeli claims of success and Ritter's view of impotence backed by things like Tehran life being unaffected is really stark. Ritter insists Iran's doing horrific damage to the Israelis, says their strikes are very accurate, hitting only military in nature or related to legitimate national security targetable sites.
And he attributes that assessment, incredibly, to a senior Israeli official, a former head of Unit 8200.
That's what he claims, yes. Which, if true, would be extraordinary validation for his point. He argues Israel is just too small to absorb this kind of damage, that its viability as a nation is being eroded.
Which feeds his American impotence narrative. If U.S. strike didn't stop this, what good was it?
Precisely. And then there's his really controversial take on Iron Dome.
Right. He says Iron Dome doesn't work, that it can't defend against a modern missile threat, claims Israel is defenseless now.
He does. He argues that even if they have interceptors, the system itself is ineffective against sophisticated modern missiles. That's a huge claim, challenging a cornerstone Israeli defense doctrine.
And he contrasts this with Iran, who he says is acting responsibly within international law following a decades-old plan to break the back of Israel.
Portraying Iran as strategic, patient, and law-abiding, while Israel and the U.S. are reckless and ineffective. It's a compelling counter-narrative.
And Iran's leadership seems defiant. Khamenei warned the U.S. before the strikes about irreparable damage. He's facing his greatest challenge, analysts say, and the Atomic Energy Organization says the program will not be stopped.
So the big question remains, is this Iran executing a deliberate, long-term strategy to expose weakness and illegality, like Ritter suggests? Or is the full impact of the recent U.S.-Israeli strikes just delayed, yet to be truly felt? These ongoing updates are absolutely vital for figuring that out.
Okay, let's talk money. Beyond the military and the geopolitics, there are always major economic ripples, especially when you're talking Middle East instability involving big oil players like Iran.
Markets hate uncertainty, and this region is crucial.
No kidding. Oil prices jumped as soon as Israel started its actions against Iran. That signals market risk right away. Brent crude rallied, 5.7%? Hit over $81 a barrel.
Yeah, Bloomberg reported that. Al Jazeera noted it hit $74.60 early Monday, up 7% from before the attack. An immediate reaction.
And a huge part of that fear centers on the Strait of Hormuz, right? That critical choke point.
Absolutely critical. A third of the world's seaborne oil goes through there. Roughly 21 million barrels a day. And it's only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest.
Makes it incredibly vulnerable, and there was talk of closing it.
An Iranian lawmaker, Esmail Qasari, hinted Tehran was considering closing the strait as the conflict heated up. Just the threat is enough to rattle markets.
Goldman Sachs warned a full blockade, worst-case scenario, could push oil over $100 a barrel.
A huge potential shock to the global economy. Though historically, even during the Iran-Iraq war, it was never fully closed. Tankers still got through, albeit with high risk and insurance costs.
Still, the possibility hangs there.
Definitely. And the economic impact went way beyond oil. Global stock markets took a hit. Wall Street, the S&P 500, NASDAQ, both down over 1% on Friday.
Middle Eastern markets too.
Yep. Egypt's main index down almost 8% Sunday. Tel Aviv down 1.5%. European markets drifted lower. Germany, France down over 1%. UK down 0.5%. Shows how linked everything is.
But some sectors did well. The usual suspects in these situations.
Pretty much. Military suppliers rallied. BAE Systems in the UK up almost 3%. U.S. giants like Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, RTX saw share prices climb.
Defense stocks often rise with conflict. And oil companies.
BP, Shell gained value, expecting higher energy prices. And gold, the classic safe haven, rose about 1%. Got close to its record high from April. Investors clearly seeking safety, moving to risk-off positions.
What about industries like aviation?
Hit hard. Airlines like Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airways had to suspend or cancel flights in the region. Iran, Iraq, Jordan shut their airspace. And since eastern Iraq is a super busy air corridor, that caused major disruptions globally.
So while some markets maybe stabilized a bit after the initial shock,
yeah, some analysts noted a relatively quick stabilization in certain areas, maybe suggesting markets hoped it might stay contained. But those underlying risks, especially around Hormuz and the potential for wider economic fallout from a long conflict, they're still potent. That initial calm could be really fragile.
Which brings us to the final crucial question. Where does this go next? Are we heading for more dangerous escalation? Or is there any realistic way back to diplomacy? The stakes are unbelievably high, especially if you buy into Ritter's analysis that the U.S. took an unconstitutional, ineffective path.
Ritter himself seems to think Iran will play the long game, legally speaking.
Yeah, he believes Iran will remain consistent to international law, won't lash out emotionally or irresponsibly, like hitting U.S. bases if they weren't involved in the strike. He predicts Iran will stick to the legal framework to isolate the United States and keep the focus on what he calls the criminal actions of Israel. That fits his whole Iran is winning narrative.
But others see Iran's options as more limited now, right?
Yeah.
After Israel's big assault.
True. Some analysts say Iran has limited options for retaliation, especially since key allies are staying out. Potential options mentioned include attacking U.S. forces in the region, trying to close Hormuz, which would be a massive escalation, or speeding up development of a nuclear weapon.
The nuclear option is the nightmare scenario.
Absolutely. And Iran's Atomic Energy Organization already declared the program will not be stopped. That's defiance right there.
And diplomatically, Iran seemed to draw a line.
Yeah, Foreign Minister Araghchi said he'd talk to Europeans, sure, but had no interest in negotiating with the U.S. while Israel continued attacking. A pretty clear precondition.
So where does that leave things? The rhetoric is hard. The potential for escalation feels very real. Are diplomatic channels completely dead?
Not entirely, it seems, but they're incredibly strained. UN Secretary General Guterres warned if diplomacy fails, we could see unthinkable levels of destruction, and global non-proliferation efforts could just crumble.
The IAEA board holding an emergency meeting also shows deep international concern about the nuclear side.
Definitely. Germany's foreign minister held out some hope, saying escalation could be avoided if Tehran shows serious and transparent readiness to refrain from developing nuclear weapons. A big if.
And the U.S. domestic politics are complicated too. Trump promised to avoid foreign wars, but also vowed Iran wouldn't get a nuke.
A real tightrope walk. Secretary of State Rubio initially said the U.S. does not seek war, wanted to restart talks, but actions matter more.
And we saw more embassies closing in Tehran, Australia, New Zealand, Czech Republic, Slovakia, citing the deteriorating security environment.
Right. Australia's foreign minister mentioned working with Rubio to prevent an Iranian nuke and pursue peace. But that final warning from Khamenei's advisor,
The one saying any country used by the U.S. to attack Iran becomes a legitimate target.
exactly, with tens of thousands of U.S. troops scattered across the Middle East, that's a chilling threat. The whole world is just holding its breath, looking for any sign of a way out.
It feels incredibly tense.
Okay, so wrapping this up. What does this all mean for you, trying to make sense of this incredibly complex, fast-moving situation? We've gone deep into Scott Ritter's challenging take that this U.S.-Israeli strike wasn't about military success, but political theater, maybe even an unconstitutional act. We looked at how he argues it's isolating the U.S., empowering rivals, while the impact on the ground in Tehran seemed minimal, and the world reacts with condemnation and desperate calls to de-escalate. All while Iran, according to Ritter, continues its claimed lawful long-term plan to break the back of Israel.
Yeah, I think if there's one big takeaway, it's that sheer military power doesn't guarantee desired outcomes in a place as complex as the Middle East. The long game, whether it's diplomacy or more escalation, has massive consequences not just for Iran and Israel, but for global stability, international law, the world economy. And Ritter's perspective really highlights how acting outside perceived international norms, especially if ineffective militarily, might just strengthen the very forces you're trying to counter. It could even push the world towards that alternative, law-based order Russia and China are advocating.
Which leaves us with this final, really thought-provoking question to mull over. Given the doubts about the strike's effectiveness, the international backlash, was this a message received by Iran? Or did it just pour fuel on the fire? Did it create a more dangerous, more protracted, legally murky conflict? A conflict that pushes the U.S. further down a path where it's increasingly isolated, increasingly challenged, and where finding an off-ramp becomes harder and harder. Something to definitely keep thinking about. Thank you for joining us on this critical deep dive. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep getting informed.